Thanks, Bo, and to Jackie Rosa, who I think was here somewhere, our co-chairs this year. Gee, this mic is, woo. And it's so great to be with all of you guys. I have a panel of shrinking violets here.
Yes.
But Amy, let me start with you. I got up this morning and I read your latest column. I think it was called something like, "Can Democrats turn it around?" Spoiler alert: are there Democrats here? It was not good news for Democrats. It would send Democrats to therapists. Perhaps too many have them, which is maybe.
That's the problem.
But but talk about that. Why
are things?
Yes. Why are you so dark for Democrats?
Hi, David.
Hey.
This is fun. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Really happy to be here. The beer tent also looks fun. So do we have access to that as non-alum?
It is fun, or this. Okay. That's why this room would.
That's
is
why
fuller than it is.
we'll be bringing.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming here instead of there. That is impressive, and it shows just how committed you are to our politics. I appreciate that.
You'll be headed to the beer tents after.
100%. So, midterm elections are different every year, but they're incredibly consistent every year. Really going back, like 100 plus years. It's almost a given that if you hold the White House, you're going to lose seats in the House, the Senate, or both. So things have changed a lot in the world, even in the last 10 years, but even that has held up. I think the challenge we live in right now for Democrats is that it's not just that they have a historical reality in front of them, but then some other historical events or once-in-a-lifetime events that are happening concurrently. A pandemic that still has not been tamed, an economy that is right now experiencing, if you've only been alive for 40 years, once-in-a-lifetime level of inflation. And the pessimism we're seeing among Americans right now is pretty rare as well. I mean, Americans are traditionally more pessimistic than optimistic when you ask them, do you think things are headed in the right direction or wrong track? But the NBC poll has had 4 straight polls with 70% or more of Americans saying they think things are headed in the wrong direction. The last time we saw things this bleak was back in 2008, right before as we were going through the financial crisis, and before that, it was 1992, where you had 4 in a row. Again, both of those revolving around the economy, 92 and 2008. So we're in unique and in some cases uncharted economic waters on top of a pandemic. And then you, as the party in power, you have to decide, well, what are you going to do about that, right? This is a bad environment. The winds are in my face. You can spend a lot of time trying to convince people that things aren't that bad, which isn't going to work because, especially with inflation, you feel it. You cannot, this is not something that's only impacting people over here or people over there. Every single person feels that.
And they get mad if you tell them that things aren't
That's
as
right.
bad as they think.
I mean, it seems really condescending to say it's fine, it's transitory, whatever. So you have to acknowledge that. But the second is, it's really hard for the government to do much about inflation. It is the Fed's job. But even the things, and Heidi can talk about this too, even things that Congress could do, not going to really want to do, right? If you talk to economists, they say, well, one of the best things we could do is lift the tariffs off China, right? That would be good. That would help boost things.
Or start collecting on student loans again.
Exactly, or start collecting on student loans. Or bringing more immigrants in to help with our labor problem. Oh, does anybody want to do that? No.
This is why economists and political consultants often come to blows.
Right, the answers are there. So you have all of that on top of, and then the final challenge then for Democrats is, well, how can we make this race then? If we can't fix inflation, we can't make the economy better. The one thing that's really troubling people between now and the election, what else can we do? Well, we got to turn the focus off of how bad things are with the Democrats and being in charge and put it on the Republican candidates and how bad they are. And I think there's been a hope for a long time that Donald Trump is going to help that, right? Because he can't help but inject himself in politics. He can't help but, he's endorsing all of these candidates. He's still talking at length about the election being rigged and stolen. And Democrats are hoping that voters are going to remember that, are going to associate Republican candidates with that, except that he's not in the White House anymore. And it's not in your face anymore. He was a daily presence for most people, and he's not there. And so he doesn't bring that level of intensity to Democrats that he did when he was in the White House. So it's just across the board a pretty challenging experience. Should I say more? Or?
No, I see
that.
people. There are Republicans who are, and then there are Democrats who are sinking into their seats here. Heidi, you've been on the winning and losing side of these things, and you're from a very tough state.
Yeah.
But you were tell that story. This wasn't a midterm election, but it does speak to how national trends are really important. You talked about your own election and how much the president's standing impacted on your own chances.
Yeah, so in 2012, when I ran, Barack Obama was not popular in North Dakota. I mean, that's an understatement. So how unpopular was he? When we did tracking polls and we followed how much could the headwind come at me as a Democrat and I could win, even though we knew that we would have the lowest percentage in the country for President Obama in his reelect. And so we would track, and at the point at which Barack Obama would lose North Dakota by greater than 22 points, I would lose. And so I knew that I could weather a 22-point differential which means that I could get 22% of the people who voted for Mitt Romney to come back over and vote for me. I mean, think about that. No one thought I could win, but we knew from our tracking and from our understanding, I had high visibility, high name ID, coming off, had a very unpopular, although didn't make mistakes the way Claire McCaskill's opponent did or Joe Donnelly's opponent did. So I knew that we could win if we kept it there. That's the headwind we could endure. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what happened in 2018? 2018, I'm running for re-election. My model was, if I deliver for North Dakota, 2 farm bills, community bank reform, which is critical to North Dakota, might not like it, but opening up oil exports for our oil industry. I had accomplished things that people, quite honestly, did not think that I could accomplish, aided by people in the Democratic caucus who wanted to help me deliver for the state of North Dakota. So you would think, okay, you know, even though she's a Democrat and people don't like Democrats, she should be able to make it based on performance. We go into that election. Donald Trump won North Dakota by 34 points. It was the 3rd highest in the country, behind Wyoming and West Virginia.
This was in 2016.
2018, which would have been his first midterm. So Donald Trump, that just understand how popular he is. But the single most significant factor was that where I could count on 22% of Republicans or people who voted Republicans to cross back over, it was 4. Mm-hmm. That's how polarized this has gotten. Now, I want to just comment on Amy's part, because if you say everybody's got an attitude, everybody's set on how they're going to vote. Let's assume for a minute that people come to the polls and vote the way they voted in 2020. It's just stable, you know, and Donald Trump got a lot of votes in 2020. We're defending the Senate in states that we should win or overcome in the open seats. Even in North Carolina, we should historically have a shot. But what we're up against is we're up against a deflated Democratic base and an energized and angry Republican base who think that if only Donald Trump had gotten elected, we wouldn't be in this trouble. And they are motivated. What motivates people in midterms is anger. Do they think it's right? Do they think that throw the bums out? And so what I would argue in optimism to what Amy said is, number one, we thought we were going to win more seats in the House of Representatives, right? When Joe Biden, there was no coattails. We lost how many seats in the House, Amy?
12.
12. We lost 12 seats. We thought we were going to gain 30. When we went into election night, we thought we were going to have many more Senate seats, although the Senate was tough that cycle, but we really believed that we were going to pick up seats. We lost seats down to 5 votes. So I would argue that some of the midterm failure that we would have, we've already experienced in the 2020 election.
Yeah.
And we have good candidates. The people left standing on our side are very good. Abigail and Elise, and I could go through the whole list of amazing candidates. The headwind is so overwhelming. And so if people are willing either to not show up and vote or to change their vote and say they were right, Donald Trump was the answer to our problems, I think that this is not going to be a good year for Democrats.
Can I say one thing about Heidi, though, that I tell her this story all the time of being at an event with farm association leaders. And as I told you, I don't know anything about ag, so I don't know what category he was in. But he was from North Dakota. It was in 2018. I asked him about his senator, and he said, oh, she is great. Every time we come to Washington, she meets with us. She's done great stuff back home. Oh, wow, so you're going to support her? No. I'm a Trump guy. I was like, okay, all right. So she's not done anything wrong.
Yeah.
In fact, you actually like her. So there are people who will go and, it's not you, it's
your national label.
Let me ask Sarah about this. Are there swing voters these days? I mean, we've become so tribal in our politics that the number of swing districts is, 33 now? Down from
51 or 55.
In the last cycle. That means districts where the presidential race was within 5 points. So how much play is there in the electorate?
I still think there's lots of play. And I guess I'll be the Republican up here who's going to make the more optimistic case for the Democrats. And it's because the Republican Party, you may have noticed, they're not sending their best. And look, I watched Virginia happen. There was a huge swing, but went against Democrats there was a 10-point swing, 12-point swing, where Joe Biden won by 8, and then Youngkin won by 2. So those are swing voters.
How much is that a function of people who voted one way voting another, and how much is it a function of disparate turnout, which is what both these guys were referencing?
So I think it was a combination of the two. There was absolute, I focus group all the time. Across the board, Democrats, Republicans, but in that race, which I focus grouped it both before multiple times and then after multiple times. What you heard from the Republicans was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go vote for any living, breathing Republican. Like this was a revenge tour for the election being stolen. And then you talk to Democrats, and like I always say, the political science term for the way Democrats felt was like blah. They're just like, it's so bad, everything's terrible. And so there was definitely going to be a turnout differential. But if you listen, there was a ton of Biden to Youngkin voters, and one of the reasons was that Youngkin. People, McAuliffe ran this referendum on Trump, and people that worried people. But then they met Glenn Youngkin, and they were like, "This guy's not Trump. I don't believe that."
And he also localized issues.
He localized a bunch of issues, and look, people. There's always like a moms thing, right? There's always the soccer moms or the military moms or whatever. I mean, I think there was a sort of a COVID moms thing happening, more like COVID parents. where around education, where their kids hadn't been in school had been disrupted, people were super frustrated. There was a bunch of other kind of social issues, cultural issues that were going on in Virginia that moved things. But the point is that yes, people can swing, and that candidates really matter. I read this, you said this recently, and I think it's really true. And so the Democrats' best hope for me, as far as looking at the party, is in these governor's races. So you got governors and secretary of state races where, like in Arizona, you've got a woman named Carrie Lake running in Arizona, she is a My Pillow guy endorsed, anti-vaxxing, former sort of newscaster who loves Trump and says she wouldn't certify an election going forward. And she's running against Katie Hobbs, who's a pretty normie Democrat, who's the current Secretary of State in Arizona. And that's a good matchup. I'd take that matchup if I was Democrats. The Republicans in Pennsylvania just nominated by a landslide a guy named Doug Mastriano, who was putting people on buses to January 6th. And who is kind of a crazy person who's always wearing like a hat, like a Civil War hat. And so, he's like a weird guy. And he's running against a normie, the Attorney General there, Josh Shapiro. And that's a good matchup. And then if you've got Fetterman on the ticket against Oz is a weird...
Lieutenant governor.
Who's the current lieutenant governor, who's one statewide, and who I've literally never heard. Only Donald Trump is the only person I hear candidates talk about with as much love as Democrats talk about John Fetterman with. And I also think John Fetterman has this weird ability to potentially pick up some Trump voters. I also heard in a focus group Trump voters say that they might vote for him, a couple people. That never happens anymore. So I think that there, yes, are still swing voters, and I think that candidates really matter, and that the Republicans' big weak spot here is going to be putting up, especially in governors and secretary of state races, a bunch of really weak candidates against some decent Democratic candidates, and there might be a Senate race or two. And so while the underlying fundamentals are really against them, and the House is definitely gone, it's these individual races are going to matter, and some of it's going to come down to there's still a lot of time left. Can Democrats, I haven't seen evidence that they can do this yet, but I would like to see evidence that they can prosecute a case against a bunch of these Republicans who are outside of the mainstream. I talked to a lot of swing voters, and it's true, Trump is on the ballot for the people that he attracts right now. He is not on the ballot for the people that he repels. But these candidates are not Glenn Youngkin candidates. They're super Trumpy in their own right. And so can they repel these swing voters? I think that is possible, but Democrats are going to have to get their political big kid pants on a little bit here and do a better job of making the case.
Yeah, not their habit.
But
Can I ask you, Amy, I think that a lot of Democrats, and Heidi would probably agree with this, agree with your assessment that the best chance Democrats have in 2022 is Republicans, and that Republicans may make it more possible to win despite these headwinds. Is there a point at which that becomes irrelevant?
So we have this conversation all the time. I'm sure we've had it. Thinking about worst candidates of the past, right? Ones who pulled defeat from the jaws of victory.
We saw some of that in 2010.
We saw that in 2010. We saw that in 2012, where I was on a panel after the election with a Republican consultant. She said, yeah, I knew we weren't going to be winning these certain Senate races when someone came up to me and asked me, now, can you remind me, who's that candidate you guys have, the one who made those rape comments? And she goes, and when I had to say which one, I knew we had a problem with our candidates. So, but the conversation we're having is, if those candidates were on the ballot in 2022, would that be disqualifying? Did Trump really, I hate this term Overton window, but did he move the ability for candidates to be able to,
on sexual assault?
On everything. You can be anything now, and it doesn't matter, because this person can be the worst person in the world, but at least they're not a Democrat. This person can be the worst person, at least they're not a Republican. I don't know that I firmly believe that. I do think that candidates still matter. I do think that voters are able to make distinctions. Now, it's easier to make a distinction with the governor's races, which I agree with Sarah that Democrats, I think, are going to do a lot better in governor's races this year. One, because of the issues that Sarah brought up, and two, especially because so many of these are in swing states or bluish purple states, the issue of abortion, which is going to come to the states. And so candidates on the Republican side who are running on the no exceptions, we're going to put it in the Constitution, that is going to be a significant problem.
And you can sort of see that in the way in which the Republican leadership in Congress is talking about this issue, which is to say hardly at all.
So
They really don't want
yeah,
this.
so this is the point where we don't kind of define the differences very clear for voters, right? So Chuck Schumer puts on the floor of the Senate alleged codification of Roe v. Wade. There's a whole big discussion. You know, instead of saying, look, we're going to define them by putting Plan B, which is the morning after pill, we're going to put that on the ballot, right? So if Chuck had taken a Plan B vote and the majority or most of the Republicans had voted against the morning after pill, that's a defining vote that tells you what the difference is between the two political parties. And I get the need to reinstate and to protect Roe v. Wade. I've been pro-choice my whole life, but it's bad politics when you don't define the differences. So you want Build Back Better instead of putting $35 cap on insulin prices, right? So there's tons of ways that you can create a legislative agenda that is defining. It may not do big things, but it tells the voters what the distinctions are and the differences. And when it's not brought simply, it is irresponsible and it's illogical, and voters say, I don't know, they're saying this and they're saying that, I don't know what's true. But I know that my gas prices is $6 a gallon, so out.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and we should point out that the Michigan Consumer Confidence Index was at 90 in March of 2021. It's now at 59,
Yeah.
which is
a huge indicator.
quite low. Sarah, you do this wonderful podcast.
It's fantastic, by the way.
The focus group.
You should all subscribe.
And so you, as you point out, you're doing focus groups all the time. Do you think that the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade has the potential to galvanize voters who would have sat it out and are more inclined to vote Democrat than Republican?
I don't, and I haven't been bullish on this from the beginning. And look, again, it goes back to the ability of Democrats to prosecute the case. So I very much agree with Heidi, and I would like to just take this moment to say if Chuck Schumer holds one more show vote, I'm going to lose my mind because these are not defining things. There is an offense strategy here that nobody seems to be sort of galvanizing. Like if Democrats can prosecute a case, one of the things that's super interesting about Donald Trump and the people who voted for him. So in going into 2020, one of the main people that I did focus groups with was college-educated suburban women. And a lot of them voted for Trump, but a lot of them were in our kind of swing voter, people that were persuadable to get for Biden. But one of the things that was always interesting about people who voted for Trump was that they actually liked the fact that Trump was more socially moderate. And so there were a lot of pro-choice people who voted for Donald Trump who saw him as a social moderate who wasn't demagoguing a lot of things like abortion or gay marriage. And so the question is like, this should be an issue where you can get people to care about this. But I think the problem is that the way that the leak happened actually really matters psychologically, because it wasn't this shock to the system, it was like a confusion. And so nobody's been able to kind of marshal the pushback yet, because it hasn't exactly happened. And so I just think it's created this muddled environment in which, and I have a sort of a much longer thing on this that I guess I don't want to do, but the contours of abortion have changed. I never hear it come up. Like I never hear it come up in focus groups, not among Dems. The only time it comes up is among Republican women who say, I'm pro-life, so I could never vote for a Democrat, and that's why I held my nose and voted for Donald Trump. And so my concern is that it matters a lot to some people, but it is not a high salience issue broadly. And because it has happened in this weird way, I just think Democrats haven't figured out how to seize it.
Although it's not, we don't know how it's going to happen. There's going to be a decision at some point. Either it will be what is expected or it will be something else. But if it is what's expected, presumably that will be another milestone in this. But go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. I was listening to a group of a focus group, 2 focus groups with sort of low propensity Democratic voters. And where they took this was not as much even about abortion, but what comes next, to your Plan B point. Oh, then they're gonna come for gay marriage. Then they're gonna come for contraception. Then they're gonna, so they are worried and angry. Now, is that enough to propel them? Because to vote, so on the one hand, they're scared and angry and they know exactly who's doing this. It's not a surprise that they're not saying, I wonder which party is responsible for this. They know exactly which party that is. At the same time, they talk about how disappointed they are that Biden hasn't done the things that he was supposed to do on student loans, on fighting back, and that's this going on offense thing. What they want to see from Democrats is they want Democrats, as one voter said, you need to fight fire with fire. These Republicans are taking it to us every day and we don't fight back. Biden's too weak, he's not strong enough to do it. Where is someone punching back? And because the moderator asked, well, what is the Democrats' response, do you think, on abortion? What do you think their answer is? And this one woman's like, I'll be honest, I have no idea what they're saying.
Yeah.
And granted, and these are low propensity voters, which that's who Democrats need to get out, right? These are voters who came out to
Heidi,
vote against them.
let me ask you something about this. I know you got a thought there, but I wanted to jump in before you expressed it. This speaks to a larger problem, which is that these problems that are driving voters right now are not easily solved.
No.
And there is a sense of sort of futility around. I think, Biden passed this bipartisan infrastructure bill. He did pass the Rescue Act. I think a lot of people would give him credit for his handling of Ukraine. But there is this sense that things are out of control, and that there's and a futility, and as Amy said, maybe weakness. What do you do about it? Because he's at 41%.
Right. So here's the problem. Biden had to make a bigger first impression. So he won because he wasn't Trump and he wasn't leading the pandemic. Seriously, that's why he won. Trump got 74 million votes and won the states. So let's just calibrate this. It wasn't a big Biden victory. They weren't voting for Biden, but he had a chance to kind of come out of the blocks. He did a couple things right. He addressed the pandemic, did this, but which led to arguments that you're driving inflation, even though deficit spending was at record highs under Trump. And so they never pushed back on that. And he tried the bipartisan thing, right? I'm the peacemaker, everybody loves me, I'm everyday Joe, instead of fighting for a narrow agenda that was defining for his presidency. He thought he was FDR and went out for the big enchilada saying, I can get it all. It was a tactical, huge mistake because he needed to prove his mettle and his energy early on. And so he got caught in an inter-party dispute between the progressives and the conservatives, picked the progressives, stalled out the bipartisan infrastructure bill to the point that it didn't have the kind of political jump it should have had, and never delivered on Build Back Better.
So,
right?
but just to get to my question, what would you do now?
What I would do now
he do now
is I would take a series of defining votes that showed the contrast, not abstractly, but the real contrast. Okay, so we're going to tax the windfall profits of oil companies. And we're going to provide that in LIHEAP, which is the program that helps people heat their house. We're going to give, vouchers to people who ride mass transit. We're going to give you a gas card, whatever it is. So you use, and it may, this blasphemy for me coming from an energy state, but there's you call the Putin profiting. And we're going to tax your Putin profit, and we're going to give it to ordinary people because you're gouging, right? So you define in a very way. You put Plan B and stem cell research, which is on the chopping blocks, because a lot of people wouldn't take the vaccine because they believed that it was done from embryonic stem cells, right?
Right.
So you do the things that define the difference, and you say, that is who Ron Johnson is. Ron Johnson's the guy who wants you to spend $800 a month for your insulin when it's not been any different than it was 50 years ago, and they're gouging you. He's in the pocket of these people. That's who he's defined by. This is who we're defined by. We're fighting for you. And that's not happening because everything in the Democratic Party is overthought and overcomplicated.
Could we, people, I'm going to go to questions shortly. I was supposed to do it a few minutes ago, and I'm not going to do it right away either. But could you, anybody who wants to line up behind that microphone for questions, please feel free to do it. Don't feel compelled, but we'll be insulted if you don't. So, I wanted to ask Sarah, we can't leave this without talking about Trump, because everything, you know, I mean, I sit on television, there's all this discussion, what does this, you know, what does this mean for Trump? He didn't get this person, he got that person. Next week in Georgia, he's likely to lose badly, at least in the governor's race, which was a pure reprisal for the certification of the election in Georgia. What are we learning about Trump? Because I spoke to you a few weeks ago and you said, look, this is the Republican Party. It's mini MAGA, MAGA, and mega MAGA. So, see, I stole your line. What do we know about the strength of Trump in the Republican Party from these primaries thus far, and how should we watch them?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're going to go through this primary cycle, and all the stories are going to be about Trump's endorsements and his relative strength in the Republican Party based on these endorsements. And people are going to take their microscopes, you know, their magnifying glasses out, and they're going to be like, Georgia, Kemp won. That means that, you know, Trump is his grip waning on the Republican Party. And the answer is no. If you look at the Republican Party and all of the candidates, if you look at Ohio, there was one sort of, not even an anti-Trump candidate, but a post-Trump candidate. He came in third place. He got about 20% from the suburban areas. You look at the Pennsylvania race, it was
30.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Matt Dolan?
Yeah.
No. Well, keep going.
Anyway, if you look at the Pennsylvania race, it was MAGA, 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 right? It was, I mean, even the fake non-MAGA candidate, David McCormick.
Counterfeit MAGA, yeah. Counterfeit MAGA.
Yeah, they're all, so like Trump, the whole party has moved 10 steps Trumpward, and the candidates going to emerge are going to be incredibly Trumpy. And so the idea of like whether or not, like Trump, he's only endorsing one person in each race, but all of the candidates are endorsing him. They're all pro-Trump. And so I think that people should sort of ignore a lot of the analysis about Trump's relative strength, because the whole thing is Trumpy. And look, there's still some laws of political gravity. Like for Brian Kemp in Georgia, he is an incumbent. Incumbency matters a great deal, no matter what. He also passed an election integrity bill. So one of the main shots at him that he, you know, didn't overturn the election. People remember that he passed this big bill that, you know, made elections safer. He also handled COVID really well by their measure. He was a lot like DeSantis, kept the state open really early. And so I've focus group Georgia, the focus group podcast is going to come out tomorrow about Georgia. And you know, people are like, he made a positive difference in my life. You know, I like him. He's doing a good job.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
There's no anti-wing and pro-Trump wing. I think that's important to understand. Even in these races where Trump loses, he doesn't lose to an anti-Trump candidate.
And the anti-Trump people aren't running.
And what is your estimate on the likelihood that Trump will run for president in 2024?
I think the chances are really good. That's what he tells people. I mean, he tells people he's going to run. Now, some of that is that it's very important to him to maintain his grip on the Republican Party and to make sure that he is seen as the head of the party. I think it also happens to be true, but it's important to him to be seen that way. So he would not suggest that he wasn't going to run. So, but I think some of it matters about what happens in 2022. It's why these governor's races are so important. If you take a democracy frame and not a partisan frame, these governors and Secretary of State races, Trump has handpicked Secretary of States all over the place who he thinks would not certify elections for him. And so if the bunch of them lose and things are not as stacked for him, If he comes out of this, because again, I think, he has endorsed people who took winnable races for Republicans and now have made them toss-ups and or lean D in the case of governor of Pennsylvania. And so if he comes out looking weaker because a bunch of winnable seats lost, that's the kind of thing that doesn't help him as much. But I think he has every intention of running. And the idea, and I think Biden says that if Trump runs, he's going to run. The idea of rerunning the 2020 election between these two octogenarians.
No one in America wants
bananas.
Look at how excited you all are.
Yeah.
It's 160 years of experience. All right, can we take a question?
Hi, my name is Divya Marothra. I'm a first year at the college studying business economics and political science. I actually really enjoyed your conversation about, Democratic's messaging about specific votes. Most recently in the House, they voted on the baby formula shortage, so funding the FDA. I believe it was about 192 Republicans in the House that voted against it. Part of it is these defining votes that sometimes do happen, but the flip side is that Democrats aren't messaging that there are 192 Republicans that chose not to vote to help, people that are mothers that don't have access to baby formula right now. So what can Democrats do on the messaging end, as opposed to just, having these votes, but now messaging in the media, in town halls, in front of their voters? This is what the Republican Party is looking like, but this is why you need to vote for me.
Heidi?
Well, I mean, the one thing if you talk to senators and you say, well, do your constituents know? I sent out a tweet. I sent out a press release, and I said, repetition is the mother's milk of communication, political communication. We go to the next thing. We think everybody knows we've done this. Everybody knows we have record unemployment, numbers. Not record, but we have a low unemployment number. And so there's never any consistency or theme to the messaging. And so I have a dear friend, her name's Barbara Mikulski. Barbara is a prickly, anybody who's ever dealt with Barbara, but Barbara loved me for some reason, probably because I grew up a lot very similar to she did. But she would say something, she said, the Democrats do best not when they're just talking about the macroeconomic issues, but when they're talking about the macaroni and cheese issues. We need to message the macaroni and cheese issues, and we don't do it. And I have two very liberal colleagues who have started a caucus in the Senate called We Suck, because the Democrats can never seem to deliver a message that it has any staying power.
I just want to make one comment before we take the next question. Well, two really. One is, it's too bad repetition, you said it's the mother's milk of politics. It's too bad it's not the baby formula of politics, because with repetition you could produce what America needs.
There you go. We're all in the puns.
But the point I want to make, and this is really a point about both parties, I think the impression a lot of Americans have is that a lot of what goes on in Washington is about positioning the other party for the next election. It's not really about solving problems. So I take your point, and I think Democrats could be more artful, but there is an enormous amount of cynicism about politics generally, because there is a sense that too often it's about gaining political advantage for one party or the other party, and less about solving problems. And I think I would venture to say, if there are a lot of young people here who get frustrated with the lack of solutions. And so we're talking about an election. I asked you a question. You gave a good answer from a strategic standpoint about what needs to be done. But I think we all ought to be sensitive to the level of cynicism there is out there about this whole circus that people see politics to be.
I also think it's challenging when you're the party in power and there's a problem, you're supposed to be able to fix it. And so saying, well, Republicans voted against it, it just, for voters, they're just like, okay, well, so what? You're in charge, make it happen.
Yeah, but how do you know that $35 insulin won't pass?
Right, take the vote.
Yeah, well, passing something would be good.
Passing
well,
something
that's
would be
my
good.
point. My point is, put things on that the vast majority of people say, yeah, that's a really good idea, and pass it.
Yeah.
How do you know you won't get 60 votes?
Yeah.
You don't. But when you make this a binary kind of, you go in your corner and I'll go in my corner, as opposed to what's the moderate middle that we might be able to advance. And if you vote against baby formula, here's a great example. They voted against baby formula theoretically so that they could hang the Democrats with the responsibility of having a shortage of baby formula. That's pretty cynical.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying, I'm not absolving any party here. But, well, let me take another question here. I don't want to deprive, we got people waiting.
It's good.
Hello, thank you all for coming and for your great insights today. My name is Sarah. I'm a third year in the college. And I had another question for Heidi, also kind of related to democratic messaging. You mentioned how the Democratic Party right now really needs candidates who are going to have like direct initiatives to push back and fight back against the Republican agenda. Do you think that means that appeals to bipartisanship should be off the table for the midterm elections?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think that when you are arguing about solutions that could fit in the middle, let's take climate, okay? Climate's a great, I think anyone who has studied climate knows that we are not by 2030 going to be exclusively renewable. I mean, we're going to need nuclear, we're going to need clean natural gas. There is space in the middle that you could formulate a policy and say, I'm going to be pro-climate. We can do natural climate solutions with farmers. They're ready for it. But when the religion on the other side is climate's not a problem, then you draw the contrast. I'm not saying that we're going to be 100% green and that you have to do all these renewables, but I'm saying we can develop clean energy. You have to be clever. David and I talked yesterday to a young man who wants to run for the legislature. And, a lot of blah, blah, blah. That's what I call the Democratic messaging. It's blah, blah, blah. And I said, why don't you say you're going to reduce the tax burden on small businesses by taking away the collection responsibility for mom and pops who have taxable sales less than $50,000? Guess what? The moms and pops who have taxable sales less than $50,000, they're going to nod their head. In politics, the sweet spot in America, when you're talking about an issue, is when half of the audience is going, yeah, that's a good idea. And it's one of the reasons why I've been successful in a small state, because I've had to reach to the middle. I've had to think about what's those policies that can get broader support. And when perfect becomes the enemy of good. Student loans is another great example. So if I had student loans today, I wouldn't talk about forgiving student debt. It's not popular. I would talk about reducing interest on student loans retroactively. Student loans, the interest rate is 6%. A lot of people never pay it down because it compounds. So if you said that's usury, especially when the Fed's borrowing at less than 1%, we're going to write down the interest and apply the excess interest that you've paid over the last 10 years against your principal. And then I've got the argument that you paid your student debt. I'm just adjusting what was inequitable to begin with. So there's a way to fashion the dialogue around these issues that you get half the audience nodding their head as opposed to, not going to do that.
And can I just say, it's not just messages, it's also messengers. Like, if I had to say, like, one of the things that I think is the huge Democratic weakness right now is that there is not an army of surrogates out there making the case, going on offense. Heidi should be on TV a lot more, making these very good arguments going on all the time. You need a face of the Democratic Party. Like, Joe Biden, for various reasons, seems to do a lot of his pitches at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Kamala Harris is like nowhere to be seen. One of the main things you hear from Democrats in the focus groups is, why don't I see Joe Biden more? Why don't I see Kamala Harris more? Well, like, where is everybody? Where is everybody out there pitching this agenda, telling people what they've done? People have no idea what was in BBB, but they also don't know what was in the American Rescue Plan. They don't know what was in the infrastructure bill. Like, there were things, to your point, that got done, but nobody's out there relentlessly selling them. And it's allowed for this, you can just feel all the energy being sucked out because everyone's got this fait accompli that we're all doomed. But, like, you got to go on offense.
But you also have to have a plan. David's right. You have to have something that people believe could, in fact, pass and be successful as a strategy.
Can we and I should point out, you're an alum, obviously. I should say class of 76. Is anybody here from the class of 76? They're probably not in this group. You are. Did we know each other? Anyway, go ahead.
My name is Colin Smith. I'm actually an alum of lab school. And there's an elephant in the room that you've not been talking about, which is voter suppression and the gerrymandering issue. And it seems like that's the real headwind that the Democrats have to face, along with not having charismatic representatives. So it seems to me like the hope for Democrats is people like Stacey Abrams and John Fetterman. What do you guys think about that?
Amy?
I get this one. So there's no doubt that gerrymandering plays a role in this. We just discussed the fact that there are not many competitive districts. In some ways, that actually works to Democrats' benefit because they've shored up. Part of gerrymandering is also keeping your incumbents safer. And remember, Democrats did a lot of their own gerrymandering. They just happened to get thrown out by the courts because the judges weren't in on the joke that when Democrats said we don't like gerrymandering, but they meant it, right? The challenge we have with gerrymandering isn't even how lines are drawn, it's where people choose to live. There used to be rural Democrats. When I came to Washington, there were 2 Democrats from North Dakota, there were 2 Democrats from South Dakota, there were 2 Democrats from Louisiana, there were 2 Democrats from Arkansas, right? It's possible, but and you can't gerrymander a state, obviously. So that we are now dividing by density. For voting rights, this is a challenge. I think the bigger, broader challenge is we're reaching a point now where after every election, one side or the other is going to believe that the president is illegitimate. That is really scary stuff. And you can't have a functioning democracy when half the people believe that the person who's sitting there was put there in an illegitimate way. I think we have to find a way, instead of continuing to say there's so many problems with voting, there's so many and they're undermining and we've got to find a way to get people to trust in the system. And unfortunately, Republicans, well, let's put it even a finer point on it, Donald Trump ruined that. I talked to so many Republican secretaries of state and state commissioners who were doing election stuff in 2020 during the middle of the pandemic. They were all absolutely committed. What do we need to do to make sure people can vote? They were putting out voting boxes and early mail and all of this. It was happening. Donald Trump single-handedly undermined that. Now, can it come back? I hope so, but it is a much more worrisome trend.
I want to take, because I now know that this was thank you for your question. I want to take the guy behind you because he's a graduate of the class of 76.
There actually is a lot that Congress could do about inflation. It's really because people like programs but aren't willing to pay taxes, so they end up having to be funded by money creation. But Democrats apparently haven't been able to make the argument that it's really deficits. But is there a package of human capital investment that would have some credibility about producing long-run wealth? And it could even add scholarships or vouchers, which Republicans claim they like, but straightforwardly be paid for by taxes to show another difference.
Wait, so that's a question. Heidi, you want to?
Well, I mean, I think when you look at investments, whatever that is, and I have a pet project, I think that a lot of what you're seeing in record suicides, record addiction, all of this is driven by the phenomenon of childhood trauma. And childhood trauma is a huge indicator. So how do you address childhood trauma? You got to do it in communities. You got to do it in schools. You got to create greater resiliency for healthcare. You've got to put more responsibility back on people. No one wants a long-term. No one wants a calibrated long-term response to America's problems. They want to fix it tomorrow. And guess what? These problems are not going to get fixed tomorrow. And when we ignore systemic changes that need to be made, whether it's in Social Security, which basically, well, I think this year doesn't pay for itself, right? Social Security, there's less money coming in than going out for the first time. And so when you look at these long-term problems, nobody wants to look up and make an investment because they don't trust you. They don't trust the voters. They don't trust people to say, yeah, that it doesn't work in my house not to do long-range planning. I expect the government to do it. They govern by fear. And when our elections are driven by fear mainly of the other, whoever that is, whether it's a trans kid, I don't know why people are so afraid of trans children. I mean, I don't get it. I don't know why they're so afraid of people at the border who need formula, but yet that fear is what motivates the drive to divide the country. And we don't have an external force like we did with Hitler, like we did with historically with a lot of the challenges in America when we pull together. We're going to have to find the internal fortitude in this country to come together to solve our problems, but we'll never do it with leaders who are fear-based. And so these are all problems, yes, that we can solve with the right solutions. These are not, solutions are easy. Getting the public to vote for people who believe in these solutions and getting people, once they're elected, to be honest about what they're doing, that's the challenge of our democracy. And that's why we got to count on the people.
This clock is counting down backwards now in red, which tells me that our time together has come to an end. But I so appreciate all of you. I appreciate all you do for the Institute of Politics. I appreciate your voices out there. And to all of you alums, these are the kinds of conversations that we have at the Institute of Politics on a every few days basis. And if you feel so moved to support the university, don't forget your friends at the Institute of Politics. Thank you very much.